Please welcome to the stage Vice President for External Affairs for the International Republican Institute, Antonia Ferrier.
Thank you. Big surprise.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 48th Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you for being here. I know, it was indeed. It was indeed. Let me give you this. Mr. Vice President, this should be on for you.
Perfect.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think I speak for everyone in this room in thanking Vice President Pence for not only being here, but for his steadfast commitment to religious freedom in the world. So I just want to give him another round of applause.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you all.
Mr. Vice President, we don't have a lot of time. I'm sure many people in this room would like to stay here for a long time and hear a lot of your thoughts, but I really want to just start and ask you a fundamental question. When you think about the world and all that you've done in terms of public policy, in terms of global affairs, this is an International Religious Freedom Summit, how does your faith impact you in terms of that mission?
Well, first and foremost, could I just invite a round of applause for Ambassador Sam Brownback
Amen.
and Dr. Katrina Lantis. What a great work.
Indeed.
What a great work they've done. Thank you all for being a part of this IRF summit. I said many years ago when I actually had a radio show back in my home state of Indiana, people would call into the show and ask me, they were trying to figure out what I stood for, and I came to say that I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. And all throughout my career in the Congress and as a governor and then as Vice President of the United States, my faith has sustained me, which I'm sure is true of everyone in this room, of every faith that is represented. And so, but it's also made me a passionate advocate for religious liberty. I mean, I think it is right to say that you are all gathered, many of you from around the world, in a nation that was founded on a first freedom. And the freedom of religion, the freedom of conscience is the first freedom, and I believe it is the God-given right of every man and woman and child in the world. So my own experience has made me a champion for religious liberty, but it's been my great honor to advance that principle throughout my career here at home and abroad.
You were recently in Israel, and I'm sure that was a pretty grueling experience. Could you tell us about that?
Antonia, I had to go. I have long been a champion of the Jewish state of Israel from very early in my career. But when I saw the horrific events of October the 7th, which was not merely a terrorist attack, I think it's important that the world understands that what I saw as I visited Sderot, as I visited Kfar Aza, a kibbutz that was struck in the early hours of that first day, it was more of an invasion, and it was the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. I literally walked through the ruins of a community, and the bullet-shattered walls and the stained floors and furniture of homes that upon which was not visited just violence, but really evil. But it instilled for me not only a deep commitment to stand with Israel as they did what needed to be done, but it also told me that the time has come for people around the world to speak with one voice and say there is no tolerance for anti-Semitism in any form, in any nation on earth. Because that's ultimately the root of what we saw there, was the the explosion, and Ambassador Brownback and I were speaking about it, the explosion of hatred that came through that fence line, 3,000 heavily armed Hamas soldiers who came into communities, as I would learn when I was there, some of the communities that were literally slaughtered were some of the communities in Israel that were the greatest champions of the Palestinian people and had worked tirelessly to build bridges and build relationships between the people of Gaza and the people of Israel. But it was that hatred, it was that animus, that anti-Semitism that I believe ultimately gave rise to that evil. And I think it's a watchword to all of us as we see protests on campuses and in streets, not only here in the United States, but across the West, to make it clear that we will stand against religious bigotry, we will stand against anti-Semitism, and we will stand for the freedom of religion of every person on earth. So help us God.
Amen. You know, there is unfortunately, as you just pointed out, too much religious bigotry out in the world, and it's all sorts of different communities. I wanted to just point out, there was a Nicaraguan priest this morning who testified behind a screen. Nicaragua is a place that is sort of dealing with a Stalinist regime that is persecuting the Catholic Church at unprecedented levels. Just wanted to ask you about some of your reflections on that and why it is that you think some of these communist regimes are so threatened by people of faith.
Well, I think the last part of your question is the most insightful, but I'm not surprised by that from someone in a leadership position at IRI. You understand the relationship between our God-given liberties and the survival and prosperity of freedom. But I think Nicaragua is simply a case in point where we see the rise of dictatorial rule, and the church becomes a focal point. And in Nicaragua in particular, I must tell you, I'm going to ask the ambassador to share with me some of the transcript of that dialogue. I think it was important that you all heard from a Catholic priest in Nicaragua, because I believe the time has come for the United States to make it clear to Nicaragua that we will not tolerate action against suppression of church leaders and religious leaders in Nicaragua without consequence. Look, we have in the United States, we have a free trade agreement with Nicaragua. We have the most powerful economy on earth, and I'm someone that believes in free trade with free nations. And we ought to make it clear to Nicaragua that you will begin to respect the religious liberty of people of every faith in Nicaragua, or our relationship will change.
No, thank you for pointing out our work at IRI. There is a connection between political freedom and religious freedom. And we talked about Nicaragua. This is also a challenge in places like communist China. There has been a brutal assault on Uyghurs, on Tibetans. There is no other space in the Communist Party in Xi Jinping's China other than the state. What do you think the United States can do to help some of those persecuted minorities within China and the Tibetans?
Well, I think communist China represents the greatest economic and strategic threat to the United States and the West in the 21st century. And we must only meet that with strength and moral clarity. Strength comes in strengthening our economy and making sure that we continue to have a military capable of defending our treaty allies in the Asia Pacific. But the moral clarity is of equal importance. And during our administration, I sought to speak out plainly and clearly. Our administration was actually the first to declare that what had taken place against certain ethnic minorities was actually a genocide. And I think it's important that the United States of America, which is a beacon of liberty for all of the world, speak clearly and plainly to communist China and other repressive regimes around the world that we have clear expectations that are grounded in the fabric of our values and our ideals. Again, I'd say I believe in free trade with free nations. And under our administration, we actually increased tariffs by some $60 billion because of repeated trade abuses by communist China. They came to the table with what the ambassador remembers was our phase one trade deal, a lot of which they haven't lived up to, I'm told, under this administration. But I really do believe the nature of our economic relationship ought to be tied to advancing the interest of our country with nations that share our core values, and standing up for Uyghurs who have been faced repression, been rounded up into camps, forced sterilization, Christian pastors, churches that have been burned to the ground, and other religious minorities. We need to speak with moral clarity, and whatever the future holds for me and my family, I promise you that we will.
Good for you, sir. Thank you. You know, there's a big world out there, and there are many people here who represent different faith traditions. You know, I'm a Catholic, as an example. I know there's a large Catholic contingency out here. There's obviously Muslims. There are folks who are of all different faiths and traditions. How do you sort of talk to them as a global community about giving them heart to keep the fight up in their countries and in their communities for religious freedom and tolerance? If you were to give them a bit of a pep talk about how to keep maybe the Lord in their hearts, get up every morning and keep fighting the good fight, what kind of pep talk would you give them?
Well, coming from a country that was literally founded by people seeking the freedom of religion, I would tell you never give up hope. Because when we make the cause of the freedom of religion and freedom of conscience our cause, I think we make his work on this earth our own. And so we never fight alone. I mean, our nation was founded when they stepped off on Plymouth Rock. It's by people that came here for religious liberty. And the other thing I would say to friends from so many places around the world in this great work, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to be here today. I must tell you that I'll embarrass him a little bit, but I personally think during our administration there was no greater champion of religious liberty in the world than Ambassador Sam Brownback.
Amen.
Because I think and when he was a senator, he actually authored the legislation to create an ambassador at large for religious liberty. And so when we were looking for who would fill that role, we called Sam Brownback. But what I didn't expect was that he would carry the love and the determination and the sense of partnership around the world the way that he did. I'll never forget, as we were laboring with the administration of President Erdogan in Turkey to release a Christian pastor who had been jailed, Pastor Andrew Brunson. And literally for months and months, we made it clear, our president did, his vice president did, to make it clear to Erdogan and others in his administration that the incarceration of Pastor Brunson was unacceptable to the American people, and we wanted him released. But all along the way, while his trial took place, believe it or not, Sam Brownback was sitting in the back of the courtroom in probably the quiet and humble way that he usually carries himself. But for me, it was so important because what it said to the government of Turkey was, we're here and we're standing for religious freedom in your country. We're demanding it for this American. But I would say that to all of our friends and partners around the world. As you labor in this cause, I believe with all my heart as I began that you do not labor alone, but just know that the American people are with you. We are praying for you, and we will continue to give voice to your efforts to advance the first freedom of religious liberty in your nation. I promise you.
if you might share with us maybe a moment, maybe when you were vice president on your travels, where you met someone that had a real impact on you in terms of just really feeling like we needed to help them fight back from religious persecution. Did you have one of those moments with a particular individual that really just was so powerful that made you sort of recommit to the cause?
It was about 3 in the morning on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base. And we had been in extensive negotiations to bring home 3 Americans that had been locked in the prisons of North Korea for years. And after months of negotiations, they were standing at the top of that stairs. As they came down the stairs, I'll never forget, they greeted me. They were walked down by the President and the Secretary of State. But they handed me a 3x5 card that had a personal note written to me on it. And I have it in my home, in my study to this day. And I cherish it as one of my most prized possessions from my service as Vice President. And on one side, it simply said, we want to thank you, Mr. Vice President, for your role in securing our release. And we thank God for the privilege of meeting you. But on the flip side, they hand wrote an ancient verse that spoke that when the captives are set free, they go forth rejoicing. And I didn't know at that time that these 3 men had been incarcerated in part because of their faith, because they were deeply committed Christians living in the darkness of North Korea. And yet when they came down that stairs, for me, they would always be emblematic of everyone that's left behind, everyone that's still living in the darkness of repressive regimes, not just in North Korea, but around the world, as you so carefully review in this summit. And it just gave me a great sense of hope that if those of us that cherish religious liberty will simply continue to give voice, if we'll continue to pair our values with the priorities of our nations, that we'll have more of those days when the captives are set free and people will be able to live in the freedom and in the daylight of the religious liberty that so many of us have enjoyed and upon which I believe the future of mankind depends. I honestly believe that the great struggle that we have in the world today is between freedom and tyranny. And at the very heart of freedom is that freedom of conscience, that freedom of religion. And so make no mistake about it, I believe the work that you are doing here, the work that you will celebrate later this week at the National Prayer Breakfast, as you hear people giving voice to their faith, and as you go home to your work, it's not just about advancing the cause of religious liberty. I want to assure all of you, I believe as you fight for religious freedom, you're laying a foundation for a more free and prosperous future for all mankind. And so God bless you all.
Amen. I think most of us here would say here to Vice President Pence. We have 30 seconds. So is there anything that we should just say to our audience before in the last 24 seconds we have to give them? I'm not going to open up to anyone to ask them a question, by the way.
Well, out of my faith tradition comes an ancient verse that says, do not grow weary in well-doing, because in due time you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. Don't give up on freedom.
Amen.
Or our most cherished freedom of religion.
Amen.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
An honor to be with you.
Let's give the Vice President a standing, whatever this is called, a standing ovation, is that what it's called? Thank you, Mr. Vice President, very much. Thank you all.